Professor Gavisa, welcome to the Nzuri Kahawa Report. We're extremely lucky to have you. And Professor Gavisa, we're going to be talking about the Oromo history in context of Ethiopian history, but also Abyssinian history. And I hope, and I'm not necessarily hope, I know for sure, for certainty, you will enlighten us the plight of the silenced majority in terms of Ethiopian history. But before we delve in Ethiopian politics during the Empire era, but also contemporary Ethiopia, please introduce yourself and give us a glimpse of what you do. I know for sure, I'm very well aware of your writings and also as well of your published books. But for the audience who do not know your work, what do you teach? Please introduce yourself, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me here. I am a professor of history and African studies at Kettering University in Michigan. I studied economic history, been publishing about history of agriculture, development, and cropping in the Horn of Africa. But because my school is a STEM university, I teach courses on technology and culture, sustainable development, and sometimes I write about those things as well. So it's about really decision making by farmers, why they decide to plant a certain crop, why they abandon and shift to another. It's about what goes into their decision making process in terms of maintaining their farm and making decisions at the farm level that really affect their livelihood, but also agricultural development, food security, and things like that.
Interesting, Professor. Well, Professor, before we delve into modern Ethiopia, enlighten us. Who are the Oromo? What are the Oromo? And where do they come from? Where are they located? They are the majority population in Ethiopia, but their history has been silenced for centuries by the Ethiopian state, by the Ethiopian media, but also for particular reason. And hope you delve us into understanding who the Oromo are as a people, as an ethnic group, the Oromo language, history, culture, but also how the ethnic composition reflects in Ethiopia and in a historical context, but also contemporary Ethiopia. If you can give us a snapshot.
Yeah, the Oromo are one of the oldest people that inhabited the Horn of Africa for many millennia. There is a local history about Oromo population movement within the Horn of Africa, and sometimes it is interpreted as if the Oromo actually appeared on the Ethiopian scene about 400 years ago, but that's not actually the case. Because the Horn of Africa, since maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago, the Horn of Africa all the way to Egypt had been populated by Cushitic-speaking people. The same applies to northern Sudan, Egypt, and in northern Ethiopia. But as time goes on, people move from a certain area, they move to other places, and they become linguistically differentiated. And in a longer period of time, they also become a distinct group of people who actually are from the same linguistic stock. So specific people in the Horn of Africa are indigenous to the Horn of Africa, and the Oromo are just one of those specific people all over the Horn of Africa. The Beja in the north, in Eritrea, the Belen, the Afar, the Saho, the Somali, the Sidama. These are all Cushitic people who, at some point in time, some 2,000-3,000 years ago, spoke the same language, but in time, linguistic differentiation, experiencing history in different ways, developing different institutions made them distinct people. The Oromo are just one of those people. They happen to be the largest in terms of demographically in the Horn of Africa and in Ethiopia. About maybe 50, 60, could be 17 million people who live primarily in Ethiopia, but also in parts of Somalia and parts of Kenya, and maybe to some extent in Rwanda. So these are just the specific people, indigenous people who have lived in the Horn of Africa for a number of years, but for comparative perspective, they are probably the second largest linguistic group in Africa after the Hausa of Nigeria. So yeah, they make the plurality, the larger plurality of the Ethiopian population, but they also live in many countries in the Horn of Africa.
Well, Professor, thank you for the introduction. I came to understanding about the struggle for Oromo during the 1960s. Basically, all the readings that I read from, I studied the Eritrea's liberation movement, the EPLF, and I started reading about the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front. That's where I was introduced to the Oromo struggle for self-determination, self-independence, but that was not the case. Oromo had been struggling for autonomy, to address ethnocide by the Ethiopian state, but also to readdress the conquest of their land, but also all the crimes that were committed in the Oromo. Why do you think certain aspects of Ethiopian history, the good and the bad and ugly, have been erased from the history books, but not necessarily erased from from the mental state of the Oromo people? Because it's impossible to it's impossible to silence the mass atrocities committed against the Oromo by the Abyssinian empires. If crimes were committed by colonial Europeans, would be universally condemned as genocide. And this term in light, I'm talking about Menelik specifically. And Menelik is a very controversial figure within Ethiopia and within the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, for some people, Emperor Menelik is, generally could be stated that Emperor Menelik is a controversial leader in Ethiopia. But his career and his reign is viewed differently by different people.
Yeah.
One of the stories in Ethiopia is that Ethiopia is an ancient country whose origin goes back 3,000 years, connected to the King Solomon. That Ethiopian civilization begins with King Solomon, that the ethnological charter in Ethiopia that legitimizes the ruling dynasties in Ethiopia is connected to the idea that the Ethiopians descended from the Israelites, and maybe through the Israelites ruled by divine right. So there is that view that maintains that Ethiopia is an ancient country with an unbroken history of dynastic rule for 3,000 years. These are the ideologues. It's not quite a recorded history, but it is an theological charter, a legitimizing mechanism for Ethiopian rulers. That is one idea about the Ethiopian state. Others suggest that Emperor Menelik, by fighting against European colonialism, particularly the Italians, and defeating them in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, saved the peoples of Ethiopia, or the peoples, and I use that in the plural purposely, that the different people in Ethiopia were saved from colonialism, from European colonialism. So this was done by Emperor Menelik, who conquered many nations and nationalities who are now resident in Ethiopia and other parts of the Horn of Africa, that he saved them from the hideous colonialism that ravaged through Africa in the 19th century. So he is viewed as someone who actually saved Ethiopia and Ethiopians from the ravages of European imperial expansion in the 19th century. I call them the apologists for colonialism. Others believe that in the Horn of Africa region, as I was suggesting about the Oromo and their origin, history of their origin, they have also developed their own institutions, their own self-government. The Oromo and other Cushitic people in particular have developed their own institutions of governance, which are egalitarian, democratic, if that word could be used some 500 years ago. So they had emerged as republics, and they lived under their own self-government as republics, and they were conquered by Emperor Menelik, and because of that conquest, they lost their economic well-being, their self-determination, their land, and their self-government, and their cultural autonomy. They were conquered, subjugated, and their identities were erased. Their ability to maintain livelihood, independent livelihood, and independent economies were suppressed. And they lived in the newly constituted Ethiopian state as second-class citizens. And for those people, Emperor Menelik is a conqueror, colonizer, oppressor. So there are different views about that. And that's what the idea about Emperor Menelik being a controversial figure in Ethiopian history begins. So the Oromo and other peoples of today's southern Ethiopia were different, whereas Emperor Menelik came from a Semitic language-speaking, Orthodox Christian champion with a state that is dynastic, conquered these people who were egalitarian, democratic, and self-ruling, with elaborate institutions of government, institutions of power sharing, institutions of economic security, and independent, independent cultures from the conquerors. Once they were incorporated, the people were conquered and incorporated into the Ethiopian Empire. Emperor Menelik and his followers also embarked on a process of state building. State building in which these newly conquered people were supposed to be made subjects or later on citizens of the country. In the effort of state building and to some extent actually nation building in the first years of Emperor Menelik and during his successor Emperor Haile Selassie, was also part of a nation building and state building. And in that effort, the Oromo and other peoples in southern Ethiopia were incorporated into the emerging state economically. Those who actually inhabited the central highlands of Ethiopia were their countries or their land, their territories were annexed. The people were subjugated, and their cultures were erased in the process of building a nation that shares the same linguistic, cultural, and moral ethos. So it's not just a conquest, and in the process of this state building, people lost their self-determination in terms of their own identity, their culture, their language. In the process of state building, they were not incorporated into the state. Their land, the economy, their economic activities were incorporated for those who were on the central provinces of Ethiopia, which happened to be the highlands. But others in the lowlands of Ethiopia remained politically and economically unintegrated. They were marginalized politically, they were marginalized economically. But the Oromo who actually inhabit the central provinces of Ethiopia were economically integrated, but politically remained marginalized. And this is what really starts the Oromo national movement to regain what was lost. Their egalitarian democratic system, which is one of their identity, to regain self-rule, to regain a say in the determination of their economic future, and to regain their ability to cultivate their own culture and determine their own identity. And that is the basis for the Oromo, and not just the Oromo, but also for Tigray. The Eritrean case is a little bit different because Eritrea was under Italian colonialism, but other peoples in Ethiopia have the same demand for what is called as self-determination, economically, politically, and culturally.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, so how do you respond to comparisons between Menelik's conquest and King Leopold's rule in the Congo, particularly in terms of mutilation campaigns and mass killings? Are these comparisons historically accurate or politically expedient?
The Congo Free State was the personal fiefdom of King Leopold.
Yes.
It was brutal because there was no state control over him. It's a private fiefdom. Until international uproar forced the Belgian government to take over the Leopoldian Congo and convert it to the Congo Free State, there was really no control over what he could do to the Congo and the Congolese people. I think that's what the Heart of Darkness, the book, The Heart of Darkness, illustrates in African history. It's a different case. It's a personalist colonialism, not even supported by the Belgian state until 1908. So it's kind of a little bit different from Menelik. In terms of the structure of control and in terms of the brutality that was meted out on the Congolese people. But to some extent, you could draw some comparisons, but you could also draw some distinction between the magnitude, the brutality between the Congo, Leopoldian Congo, and Menelik's Ethiopia. In terms of the loss of identity, in terms of the loss of self-government, in terms of the law of losing your own voice and your own say in determining your own future, it's the same. It's the same that people were suppressed, their cultures erased. You can draw some comparisons. But in the case of Menelik, the way the colonial, the conquest and the way the conquest was conducted, and the way these newer people were incorporated to the state actually determined how they were ruled and how they were incorporated into the system, the expanding Ethiopian system. In areas where the conquered people actually avoided avoided conquest, military conquest, Emperor Menelik was satisfied with making them predatory states. When he could find a structure like monarchical structure, governing structure, he was okay to reduce them to tributaries, but allow them to self-govern in some areas of Ethiopia. In areas where the people resisted, the targeted people resisted the conquest and were defeated militarily. The military conquerors, the generals, were made governors, and the generals' retinue in those areas. So in the areas where power was negotiated, like in southeastern Ethiopia and and in Western Ethiopia, what is in terms of today's Ethiopia, some level of autonomy was maintained under Emperor Menelik, but under his successor, Emperor Haile Selassie, everything that Menelik granted was folded. So it's very difficult to draw comparison between colonial system that is personal and a colonial system that was actually extending its sway over neighboring people. There are some other distinctions as well between the two because colonialism, mostly people think in terms of European colonialism extending their hegemony to people who are not whose territory is not contiguous. Second, that they're racially different. European colonialism, the Napoleon Congo or the Congo Free State, the territories were not contiguous and the people were not racially the same. So because the Ethiopian one is different, the conquered people were territorially contiguous with the conquerors and racially the same, people simply want to say that the Ethiopian version, the Ethiopian variant of colonialism is not colonialism per se. It is simply an expansion and process of state building, and many eschew the idea of using the colonial construct as a framework that describes Ethiopia's expansion, southwest expansion, and the creation of the Ethiopian state in the late 19th century. But in terms of really the effect and the experience of the people that were conquered, if comparison is needed, I think it is better to do that comparison with British colonialism in the Sudan and Ethiopian colonialism in the southern parts of the country.
Interesting, Professor. So the legacy of Amana Butcher is probably going to be in Oromo, but the year of hand and breast mutilation, I think it's called Barara Mura. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. But the year of hand and breast mutilations remains absent from, I guess you can say, Ethiopian consciousness. And I was not aware of it until I made a research on Oromo history. Why is that, Professor?
Like I was suggesting, in Ethiopia, history is really contested. The Ethiopian state never allowed anybody, any historian, to talk in terms of the Ethiopian state from Menelik to Haile Selassie and it never allowed the idea that the northern part of the country actually colonized the people in the south. And because of that, Ethiopian history is always sanitized. Ethiopian history is always was the result of basically what was his politically sanctioned. Even my own professors at Addis Ababa University, who had written some things that the government did not approve of, the dissertations that they had written in London, did not publish them because they were not allowed to. So the Ethiopian state did not want the construct, this colonial construct, or the colonial narrative to ever be told within Ethiopia. Now, in the period after 1991, where the political forces in Ethiopia that felt marginalized politically, exploited economically, and alienated culturally, created liberation organizations in the 1960s. And this goes from Tigray in the north, to Eritrea in the north, through Afar, through Somali, there were liberation organizations. For them, the narrative that this was really what Ethiopia did under Menelik was basically how states are built, how nations are built. It's no different from nation building in Europe in the Middle Ages or even before that or after. It's no different. these were the apologists that I said, look, whether you like it or not, you were conquered, that's fine, but you are better off. You're better off because you were conquered, because you were incorporated to a more civilized state, a more civilized politics, and a state that has made a name for itself in African history as the only independent country in Africa. Talking about Ethiopia as a colonial state, the northern part of Ethiopia conquering monarchy, emirates, and republics in southern, independent monarchies, independent emirates, independent republics in southern Ethiopia, and incorporating them was seen as a favor, that Emperor Menelik did them a favor. So no historian, political scientist was allowed to write about this, or if they have written a PhD dissertation, to publish about it, because that was seen as a narrative that would deconstruct the Ethiopian state. That Ethiopian state that was seen as a beacon of freedom in Africa, as a beacon of freedom for all black people in the diaspora, to maintain that idea, the idea that the Ethiopian state is actually a symbol of freedom for all black people, that it is a symbol of overcoming the colonial onslaught because Ethiopians were able to defeat the Italians. No one wanted to badmouth the idea that the Ethiopian state was an Ethiopian state that was successful, and anything that would soil that story was seen as subversive, unnecessary, and something that needed to be settled whenever it raised its head. But in the 1990s, these forces that fought against the colonial tradition overtook the government. They defeated the Ethiopian state, and they took over the Ethiopian state. And in those in the years following the defeat of the military socialist state in 1991, these groups have started to write their own history. The incident that you just referred to, the Barara Mura, is where, in the process of extending Ethiopian state through conquest, in a place called in what is today central, southeastern part of Ethiopia, in Arsi, people who were defeated were invited to sign a truce or something like that. And after the war was completed, they were invited by one of the generals of Emperor Menelik, and they were basically, and that is basically what is known as Barara Mura. But even after the war was over, after they had defeated the Oromo in Arsi in this colonial venture, after they had defeated, in order to make examples and prevent any uprising or riot or demand for independence or any political movement that has a feature of demanding independence, limbs were cut off of men, breasts were cut of women, and were displayed in Anole in the 1880s, and that is what is remembered as a time where the Oromo people were humiliated, massacred after the war was concluded, and it's still remembered in that area of the country as the beginning of the end of their own identity, their own future, and their own history and pride. But these started to come up to be published in the 1990s after these centrifugal forces, so the liberation forces that I cited, defeated the Central Ethiopian state and established, or at least tried to establish a state of all the peoples of Ethiopia. The history that you cited started to emerge. in the 1990s, and now the reverse is going on within Ethiopia. That no, this thing has never happened, even though it is in the memory of the people that experienced that event.
Yes, absolutely, Professor. I guess I want to talk to you about a taboo subject in East Africa, a taboo subject, especially in Ethiopian history, and Ethiopian intelligentsia refuse to talk about it. The extent, how do you assess the extent of slavery in Ethiopia, and also the forced labor system, particularly under the imperial regime, contribute to the marginalization of the southern people? And also during Menelik's imperial expansion. Given this legacy, how do you interpret modern Ethiopia's state structure?
One of the European travelers who accompanied Emperor Menelik during his conquest to the southern area actually wrote something about Emperor Menelik being the largest slaver and slaveholder in the world. People in southwestern Ethiopia were enslaved. One of the most important commodities that was sold to the world market through long distance trade, one of the items which integrated Ethiopia into the world economy was slaves. My own great-grandfather, who became a very well-known person, my own great-grandfather was a slave. He was captured when he was 4, sold 4 times between his birthplace in southwestern Ethiopia, sold 4 times, and finally was bought by the Swiss consul, the Swiss governor of the Ottoman Empire in Massawa. And he was freed and given to Swedish missionaries, or entrusted to Swedish missionaries as a free person. So that affected even myself, my own great-grandfather. So it was massive, the enslavement, and it stayed in place, by the way, not just the institution of slavery, but slave trade. The slave trade actually remained in place until the 1920s, when, of course, legally speaking, Emperor, at that time not an emperor, but Crown Prince, who later became Emperor Haile Selassie, in his efforts to become a member of the League of Nations, legally abolished slavery and the slave trade within the Ethiopian Empire. But that did not end the slavery as an institution, and the slave trade as a commodity exchange. What ended slavery in Ethiopia was the Italian intervention, Italian conquest in the 1930s, where slavery became more expensive in terms of opportunity cost. And it ended because it was easier to hire wage laborers than to maintain slavery as an institution and pay for the upkeep of slaves. So, slavery remained in Ethiopia, especially the southern part, not the north, the southern part, the southwestern part of Ethiopia that borders southern Sudan and Sudan to the west. That area was really emasculated, was integrated to the world economy. In addition to gold, civet, and other commodities, it is slaves that actually connected Ethiopia initially to the world economy until it became, as I said, more expensive in terms of opportunity cost.
Yeah, because my father, when he was at Addis Ababa University, he used to tell me stories, but also how Oromo were treated in Ethiopia at that time, and he has very vivid memories, very troubling memories as well, and he sees Ethiopia from a different limelight. It was a time where Oromo had to change their first and last name in order to be assimilated into whatever manufactured Ethiopianness is, fabricated Ethiopian identity. But also, imagine they were not allowed to speak their own language, which is the Oromo language. By the way, the Showa elites tried to do the same thing in Eritrea. It didn't work out so well. They abolished people from speaking Tigrinya. They were unsuccessful to do it in Oromo as well. But a lot of Oromo ended up changing their first and last name in order to be assimilated to an Ethiopian identity. I guess the colonial framework was designed to manage and exploit Oromo labor, land, and identity, but also linguistic and cultural identity. And what impact did this have on the collective memory of the Oromo people?
The whole project of imperialism and colonialism is basically institutionalized imperialism. After the initial concept, you have to put in place a minister system of governance. The British, for instance, used indirect rule in northern Nigeria, based on their experiences in India and the Caribbean. Lord Lugard invented this idea of indirect rule. The French had assimilation as a colonial ideology. So the Ethiopians, after conquest and incorporation of these southern people in southern Ethiopia, for those people who are familiar with the map of Ethiopia, the area from the capital city of Ethiopia, or the Awash River, to the south, these were people who had very different historical experiences. Once they were conquered and their land was incorporated, Ethiopia had to build a state to govern them. It's just like Lord Lugard said about colonialism in Uganda. He said, crush them first and then conciliate them afterwards. Which he said that you can't make an omelette without breaking the egg. So you have to break them and then assimilate them, or do something, embark on a colonial project an imperial project to institutionalize. How was that done in Ethiopia? Is a question that basically you asked me. In the period right after conquest, Emperor Menelik did not have time to put in place a system of control and authority and to create a capable Ethiopian state. As late as 1949, when basically the first book on Ethiopia was written by Nzuri Kahawa, the peripheries of Ethiopia, the people in the areas that bordered the Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, they did not even know that they were part of Ethiopia. The emperor had signed an agreement delimiting the boundaries of Ethiopia, but the Nuer in Gambela did not know whether they were in Ethiopia or in the Sudan. They did not recognize the borders. So under Emperor Menelik, it was still a project that was going on, experimenting on the best way to establish a functional state within the context of the imperial era in Africa in general. But it's under Emperor Haile Selassie that power that Emperor Haile Selassie himself allowed to remain devolved in Tigray, for instance, or in Tigray in the north, western Ethiopia, what is today known as Wallagga, or southwestern Ethiopia and Juma. They were economically integrated to some extent through tributes, annual tributes, but they remained largely unaffected culturally. So the idea of assimilation was adopted as a policy, and after World War II by Emperor Haile Selassie, encouraged by someone who went to the Netherlands, I think, or Belgium, studied state building there, and came up with the policy say that unless you assimilate, this is to the emperor, unless you assimilate the Oromo into Ethiopia, that assimilation simply meaning that they lose their identity as a distinct group of people within the Ethiopian Empire. Assimilated into the Amhara culture, speaking Amharic language, then the Ethiopian state would not survive. So the emperor embarked on this policy of assimilation, uh, using tactics of self-loathing and self-hate among the Oromo, demonizing Oromo-ness. Like in the literature, people write this that Oromos are warlike people, they are pagan savages, they are uncivilized, and all of this needed to be stripped of the Oromo, and that they become Amharized. It's called the Amharization. But it is a project in which the Oromo people, Oromo students in schools were subjected to this idea of you have to self-load, you have to adopt another culture in order to succeed, as an individual and as a person. Oromoness was deliberate through that their position was suppressed. The position in the Gada civilization, the Oromo Gada civilization was suppressed. The cultural aspects were destroyed, simply. Let's say their language was suppressed, their history was challenged, their own internal history, and they were ostracized within the Ethiopian Empire, ostracized as newcomers to the Ethiopian sea, as subversive people who are inassimilable. So that is the project in Ethiopia that, because as I was just telling you, that Oromos during the imperial period were subjected to this demonizing and denigrating and ostracizing them, marginalizing them as individuals and as a group, because the country, the state building would succeed according to the ideology of the imperial period only through assimilation. But the result of the assimilationist venture was further ostracization of the people, and not only just of Oromos, but as I was saying earlier, all of those liberation movements that were created during this imperial period of assimilation. So it basically was horrific when it was in place, but it didn't succeed. It actually bred these liberation movements that were established to stop the oppression, to reclaim what they had lost, and to become self-sufficient, self-ruling, and self-actualizing nations. And there is a host of them that actually in 1991 came. But as long as it stayed, it was a very difficult cultural and political and economic project that subjected people to unparalleled inhumanity.
You're 100% correct, Professor. By the way, can you introduce us to what the word Galla means? Because Haile Selassie was vividly immortalized in saying Seb way Galla, and but also the romanticization of Haile Selassie as this empirical figure, as a protector of all Ethiopians. But in reality, it's a manufactured image. He was a brutal dictator, but also a narcissist, but a deep down racist against Southern nationalities. There is no denying it. This is a person who considered Southern people less than a human being. So, in this context, what do you think is necessary for the Ethiopian state to confront these historical injustices and ensure that future generations of Oromos are not subject to similar forms of marginalization? I don't think it's ever going to happen, but how do you make sure that never happens again?
Yeah, Emperor Haile Selassie was a statesman on the international stage. This is a person who went to Geneva, made a speech in 1936 when Italy attacked Ethiopia, and showed that the international system of peace and security that was put in place at the end of the First World War was unworkable. Of course, there are two other instances, or maybe one more instance, where militarist Japan attacked Manchuria, but the League of Nations did not invoke the idea of that collective security. Ethiopia was the second, because the second country that was attacked by fascist Italy. And the emperor went to Geneva and spoke to the League of Nations, and he was booed out of that stage by Italian delegates, but also by others. That the League of Nations was not an effective system that would prevent a second world war was exposed by the emperor. Of course, the World War II started to end within Ethiopia when the British intervened in Ethiopia, not to liberate Ethiopia, but to make sure that supply lines that supported the thing the Axis powers was not there for. So it was a military strategy to reinstate the emperor during the war in 1941. So he remained an important figure because of that feat that he accomplished in Geneva. He became an elder statesman within Africa because Ethiopia remained defended itself against Italian colonialism, Adwa in the 19th century, and again evicted Italy out of Ethiopia in 1941. And when other African countries were under the colonial yoke, Ethiopia remained an independent country that defended its sovereignty against the colonial onslaught. So when Africans started to come together after many countries became independent, but also in the 1950s, he was the elder statesman. So that is his image. His image continentally and globally, that he is an elder statesman. But what you do internally is very different from what you perform on the international stage. Internally, as I was saying, because of these policies of assimilation that were enforced brutally, not only in the cultural area, but also in terms of land distribution, in land alienation, and determining economic activities, that the imposition of a racist colonial, feudal colonial structure to transfer capital and wealth from the conquered people to the center. All of these were brutal measures, and using only people from a certain ethnic group, particularly the dominant Amhara. And when I say the dominant Amhara, I do not mean people who speak the Amharic language, but people who belong to the system. The system that was created.
Would that be the Showa Amhara, Professor? Sorry, apologies.
Yes, the Showa Amhara, but there were Oromo collaborators as well who were assimilated, accepted as individuals, became part of this system. So the idea of Amhara, there is the territorial Amhara in the Amhara region, the farmers, the peasants, the people who are not involved in politics, but culturally Amhara. But there is another group within Addis Ababa. This is an interest group. They can come from anywhere, but they speak Amharic. They belong to the Orthodox Church, and they have the state. They man the state. In that system, Emperor Haile Selassie was just brutal, and that's what created this liberation front, the Tigray Liberation Front, the Eritrean Liberation Front, the Afar Liberation Front, the Somali Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Front, the Tigana Liberation Front. This is an example of saying that, yes, he was an international figure, a benevolent monarch, a benevolent dictator, but externally that is a master, but internally very brutal in all of this process of exploitation, denigration, and dehumanization of people, and that is really what really conflict, the uprising of the periphery that I just listed, the uprising of the periphery. And that issue has not been resolved until this day. That, look, from 2020 to 2022, Ethiopia was in the midst of a brutal war in the Tigray region. And that's part of the unresolved issue of state building, in which the center built by this economic group that I just said are ensconced in Addis Ababa, but do not share power, do not share economic benefits with others. And any attempt of self-assertion, which the Tigray people did in the north, was seen as subversive. And Ethiopia was subjected to this brutal, the deadliest war that claimed probably the lives of a million people. This issue has not been settled. The idea of state building using brutal military force is still ongoing in Ethiopia, but what I described is how it started. It still remains unresolved issue, in fact, threatening whether Ethiopia could remain as a unified political entity or disintegrate in the Horn of Africa.
Professor, before we make a segue post Haile Selassie, I want to ask you, what was the role of the institution of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the marginalization of the southern people? Did it play any part in it?
It was the state church. The Orthodox Church was the state church. The legitimizing mechanism for the dynasty, the Solomonic dynasty. It's the Orthodox Church that penned the story that Ethiopian rulers descended from Solomon, and through Solomon through to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, but that's a myth. That's
it's the legitimizing mechanism. It's a myth. You know what myth is? Myth is Myth does not mean that it is not true. It simply is especially true once it's constructed and people believe. Whether that is historically accurate or not doesn't matter, but it was a legitimizing mechanism.
Yeah, I mean,
so if you're a Muslim, if you're a Muslim, you're not admitted to the ruling class. If you're a Protestant, you're also ostracized. If you're a Catholic, you're ostracized. So in the creation of the Ethiopian state, right after the conquest, the soldiers were followed by the clerics, who would baptize the conquered people, 500 of them at the same time. It started with the conquest. The soldiers proceeded. The clerics, the clergy followed. The Ethiopian state and the Orthodox Church went hand in hand until 1974. It's not just a religious institution. It is also the producer of what is known as Ethiopian culture or Ethiopianness. It is really an important institution in constructing Ethiopian identity and being admitted to Ethiopianness and Ethiopian institutions. And I don't think that it has lost that stature even to this day.
Interesting. I guess going to Haile Selassie, what do you make of the African Union erecting the statue of Haile Selassie outside its headquarters? An institution supposedly grounded for Pan-African values when Selassie presided over the cultural erasure of the Oromo people, but also the ethnic nationalities. And also the fact that the prime minister is an ethnic Oromo as well, Abiy Ahmed.
Like I was just saying, on the continent, he's a continental figure. He's one of those Africans who remain independent in Ethiopian history because of what I just saying about the fact that Black Africans actually defeated or handed down an ignominious defeat to white people. There were stories that were going on in Europe at the time, like black people who turned white. Because who would believe that black people actually defeated Europeans on African soil? So because of that, Ethiopia remained, as I was just saying earlier, remained a mythical country for many black people in Africa and in the Caribbean and other places. Symbol of the aspiration of black people everywhere. Selassie was the first person. Emperor Haile Selassie was the first person, as a person, that personified the idea of independence and freedom for black people, for most Africans. The earlier generation of African leaders, like Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Nyerere, and others, these liberation fighters who liberated their own people, looked up to him, regardless of what he was doing in his own country, because of the symbolism, that he was a symbol of defiance, symbol of victory, symbol of independence. He personified that as an elder statesman. So erecting a statue in the African Union for the African Union is probably appropriate. But in the eyes of the Ethiopian people, it's not seen with favor. Ethiopians who were actually second-class citizens during all of his rule over Ethiopia for 44 years. He's a feudal aristocrat who did not ensure the equality and justice and dignity for many Ethiopians. He's someone who instituted a two-tier system in which some Ethiopians were seen as full Ethiopians and others were as less than human. Ethiopian people in 1974, when he was popular, the young Ethiopians from all walks of life, from any region or from any religion or any other cleavage, were unanimous in the fact that this feudal imperialist regime has to go. But since then, other things have happened. So on the AU campus, probably fitting, probably appropriate with other African leaders. Within Ethiopia, there were statues of Emperor Haile Selassie everywhere. Ethiopians brought them down 30, 40 years ago because they didn't want to see it. So it looks like it's an affront because there were Haile Selassie statues everywhere in Ethiopia, but they were brought down by Ethiopians some 40 years ago. But right now, there is this nostalgia for the good old days under the emperor compared to what prevails now within the country. So things have changed.
Excellent analysis, Professor. So we have to go post 1991, the APRDF. How do you assess the Oromo struggle since 1991 to present?
Well, the Oromo struggle, and I want to emphasize this over and over again, the generation of the 1960s looked at Ethiopia and did not like the Ethiopia that they were in. They wanted a different Ethiopia. An Ethiopia that is built on the will of the people, the supremacy of the law, equality for all nations and nationalities, justice, social justice, and economic justice for all. That was the idealist generation of the 1960s. From as I said, from all corners of Ethiopia, they were the idealist people who wanted to reform Ethiopia, extricate it from its imperial, colonialist, feudal past, but make a modern state, create a modern state that can work for all people and is acceptable to all the different peoples of Ethiopia. In 1991, when the assimilationist policy, which actually wanted to flatten all Ethiopians into one similar assimilated group of people, failed in 1991, where the liberation fighters actually came together and put together a vision for Ethiopia. Many of us believed that there was an opportunity to put Ethiopia on the correct trajectory, to democratize it, to federalize its governance, and to ensure the participation of people in their own government. So the different groups, the different the liberation fighters and their organizations invited other political groups that did not pick up arms against the state, and it in a national conference decided that Ethiopia needed a different kind of state building mechanism. Instead of centralizing, decentralized power. Instead of assimilating, recognize that Ethiopia is a country of different ethno-national groups. Recognize it. Instead of autocracy, in which the will of one person is ensured, create a system in which all people actually participate, not just as Ethiopians, but as ethnic groups. So recognize Ethiopia's past. Recognize that it was a country of nations and nationalities, of different ethno-national groups recognition, but also allow these people self-rule, stay on economic justice, and a right to determine their own future as a group of people, to cultivate their own culture and determine their own identity. It was an experiment that succeeded. When I say the experiment that succeeded, that the Ethiopian political groups, majority of political groups, they came together and designed a country that could work for all, in which all people feel that they belong to the state. Writing a new constitution that actually granted the right of self-determination to the ethno-national groups that demanded self-rule. Economic justice, by deciding that the nations actually decide on what to do with their land and the comparative economic advantages that they have. But most importantly, allow cultural autonomy to be who they want to be, to become who they want to become, but also create a state. The formula is self-rule in the region and shared rule in the state in a multinational federal arrangement. And as I said, this was a formula that worked for 50 years because there was there was a time of relative peace where you could travel from one end of the country to another. It was a time of economic prosperity, which started off as a 2.5% and then grew to 4.5% and then accelerated after 2004 to 2014 to double digits. It was a time of economic renaissance in Ethiopia. So it was a time of relative peace and economic growth in which Ethiopia had become an important player in the Horn of Africa, an anchor state in the Horn of Africa, an important leader in continental affairs. That was the time. It's a system that worked. But in 2014 to 2018, the Oromo, led by the Oromo, they demanded perfection. They demanded that the federal system, which was not fully implemented, be implemented, and that people actually exercise self-rule in their region. Democratize the federation. Apply the constitution, not violate it here and there. Make sure that each region is actually self-sufficient and determining their own economic success and economic future. That was the demand reforming the system to live up to its own promise. But that was scuttled, that was changed, and Ethiopia finds itself embroiled in an internecine war right now that seems to be never ending.
Professor, imagine if Meles Zenawi was your student. What grade would you give him in administering Ethiopia from 1991 until his death?
I'll give him. All right. Let's divide it into three sections.
Okay.
On governance, especially ensuring the primary role of the state of ensuring tranquility and security within the country. Not the means that he used to ensure that, but I'd probably give him like 33% for that the state was functioning from one end of the country to the other. You could travel by day or night. Maybe the means that was used could be questionable, but you had the freedom of movement in the country without feeling that you would be abducted or killed or enforced disappeared. So they get full credit on that one. On the economic front, on making sure that Ethiopia used its comparative advantages of land and labor to end poverty within Ethiopia, in terms of gearing the entire apparatus of the state to make sure that everything worked for economic development. The idea called developmental state. If you look at the results, it worked. It worked. It had some problems. It worked. On human rights, on democratic rights, I wouldn't give him that much credit, because that's where actually the discontent started. The continued suppression of human rights and democratic rights is where he fails. Where he fails to create institutions that could continue on the track that he failed blazed. There is no succession after him. On those issues of political governance and respect for rights, I'll give him only 5%. So if you add it up, that will be like 67% or something in general. I don't know if that's a passing grade or not, but it's a bit bad. Some things in a country like Ethiopia, looking back right now, even on the suppression or the restriction on human rights, looking back, sometimes I think that was he right that Ethiopia was not ready for one man, one vote, that brought democratic competition, political competition, where people vote and form their government. Was he right? Sometimes I question myself, even though I was the critic at the time because of the restriction on human and democratic rights. But right now, looking at the situation, I kind of feel nostalgic. Maybe it is true that a country like Ethiopia, that it was feudal only about 50 years ago, cannot become wholly democratic in a period of 2 decades. I don't know. I feel divided heart about the EPRDF times.
Same, Professor. Going to Abiy Ahmed's leadership contemporarily, Professor. Is Ethiopia headed for balkanization? Meaning that currently Ethiopia finds itself in an internal ethnic strife. You have the Tigray Defense Forces, who still have animosity towards Abiy's regime, especially since 600,000 Ethiopians or Tigrayans lost their lives in the Tigray War, and also this was the second time that Ethiopia used an external actor to invade its own country. The first one was Haile Selassie when he invited the British to bombard the Wayana rebellion. And you have the Oromo Liberation Front, who are parting ways with Abiy Ahmed. And you have the Ogaden Liberation Front, but also you have the Fano, which are ethnic Amharas who do not see Abiy Ahmed as a legitimate actor in Ethiopia. So therefore, are we seeing the same Ethiopia from the 1960s? So my question to you is, I know it's a heavy question, but at the end of the day, I'm a realist, and Abiy Ahmed's leadership, plagued by dwindling legitimacy among Ethiopians from various factions, and Abiy's propaganda of a greater Ethiopia and a nationalist narrative and aspirations is designed to masquerade the reality on the ground, that Ethiopia is in a process of becoming another Yugoslavia.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, in order to answer those, an astute observer of Ethiopian politics for many years, a Greek educated in America, was a university professor at the University of wrote a number of books on Ethiopia. The last one is Ethiopia, the Last Two Frontiers. In terms of his explanation why Ethiopia suffers from recurrent political problems, is the fact that the people at the center, whether that was Emperor Haile Selassie, Menelik Haile Mariam, to some extent Meles Zenawi, and now Abiy Ahmed, it's their refusal to share power with the periphery that usually leads to conflict. But the center never wants to share power with the periphery. As I was saying, under Meles Zenawi's the EPRDF during the 90s and thereafter until 2018, the formula of power sharing based on the formula of self-rule for the national groups in their homelands or home regions, and fair power in governing the center. That formula is what would have worked for Ethiopia. And as I said, it really did work for Ethiopia for the 30, close to 30 years, so 2 decades and a half, that the EPRDF ruled Ethiopia. It's easy now to look back and regret and see what kind of government that it was, because we can see it in stark relief that it was a competent government, even though it was an autocratic or authoritarian government. So power sharing, unless the elite at the center shared power in any meaningful way with the periphery, there will be no end to the cycle of conflict that has impoverished Ethiopia, held it in perpetual conflict and poverty. That cannot be resolved without power sharing. And no one has observed the Ethiopian political scene than John Markakis, the author of this book. I don't want to take time talking about what he had said under other regimes that had turned out to be true when he observed them, and later on his predictions came true. He wrote this book in 2011, and I'm just seeing what he predicted coming through under the rule of the Prosperity Party in Ethiopia. So the core of the problem that leads to conflict and instability in the arc of instability in the world is the refusal to share power. The formula under the PRDF of decentralizing power had worked, but now this man under Prosperity Power is re-centralized. Something that did not work for the military regime, for the imperial regime, is now being reinstated. You cannot rule Ethiopia from one center. It's just impossible. But they're doing it. They're also unitarizing the state instead of the multinational federation that was put in place, at least in terms of its structure for the 90s and for the last 30 years, is now being dismantled, and the unitary state ruled from the center is being put in place. That's the cause of the conflict with Tigray. That's the cause of the conflict with the Oromo, the Oromo Liberation Army today. That is the cause of the conflict in the Somali region, because only last week the Ogaden Liberation Front decided to withdraw from their agreement with the Prosperity Party and start an armed struggle. This is the problem. I do not understand why having since the 1960 generation created a problem out of nowhere, and that he is the Messiah that could correct the excesses of the 1960 generation. Where is it going? It suggested balkanization or Yugoslavianization. You know, when a country goes from autocracy to democracy, or from democracy to autocracy, there is a region in between where all kinds of bad things could happen. An anocracy. That's where Ethiopia is. Where is it leading? Where the travel from autocracy or authoritarian regime to democratization was settled in Ethiopia. It failed disastrously. It failed in a lot of bloodshed in Tigray, in Oromia, and now in Amhara. Where it's going is, Ethiopia would be lucky if this was the balkanization or follows the Yugoslavianization model. Because even though Yugoslavia disintegrated, Serbia now exists, Slovenia, Croatia, it was a brutal war, but those states now exist. In Ethiopia, the fourth line is now used to put one group against the other. So if this anocracy remains in place for an extended period of time, balkanization or Yugoslavianization is not the model. What will happen is the Rwandization model in Ethiopia on a larger scale. 120 or 130 million people fighting a war of all against all. Something needs to be done about Ethiopia. All countries that have any interest in the Horn of Africa need to pay attention to this. So Yugoslavianization would be, that's not the model that Ethiopia is following right now, because the Prosperity Party is trying to do the impossible. Creating a ruling autocracy that rules everywhere from the center. It's not going to happen, and we have seen it fail and fail disastrously over the last 7 years.
Well, that's a very nuanced perspective on the current state of Ethiopia, Professor. I think that's the first time I've heard of the Rwandization of Ethiopia, and in a very brutal way, I might say. And adding the complexity to it, Professor, you have South Sudan, which is in the middle of a civil war. You have Sudan, which has been in civil war since al-Bashir left the political scene. And you have two factions fighting for political power. Now the SAF is in control of Khartoum, and they're going to regain more real estate in Sudan. Somalia has been the Afghanistan of Africa for almost 3 decades. And the government of Somalia only has the monopoly of violence in Mogadishu, and the rest of it is just basically the Mad Max, where non-state actors roam free, where state institutions are absent, and there is no monopoly of violence. In that context, if Ethiopia goes and is saying, well, imagine your analysis on Ethiopia comes to fruition, and the Rwandization of Ethiopia, it's a reality that most people are not willing to accept. If it does happen, what would that mean for the region, Professor?
I said Rwandization on a larger scale, much larger scale. If it's going to be the war of all against all, look at what's going on in Ethiopia today. The Prosperity Party has not ruled Ethiopia for one day without conflict. It started in the Gedeo area, in the Sidama area, spread to Oromia, where the Ethiopian National Defense Force, for the first time, used helicopter gunships, even before the conflict in Oromia erupted in earnest. Then the entire Ethiopian regions and the Ethiopian economy, Ethiopian political system, the Ethiopian military, in cahoots with Eritrea and the financing from the Gulf states, went against Tigray in the deadliest war in Ethiopian history. Since the conquest, if you add the numbers of casualties since the conquest of Menelik in the 19th century to the 1990s, the number of deaths under this regime surpasses all of those averages. The bloodiest, deadliest, and catastrophic war that Ethiopia had experienced in Tigray. Then the Amhara region, which started some 2 years ago, and still war is going on, in which all the latest weapon systems in the Ethiopian military arsenal, are being used against the Amhara people. And now there is also a talk of war against Eritrea to take the port of Assad that was taken away from Ethiopia because of the collusion of the Eritrean leader and the Menelik Zenawi of Ethiopia. That is the talk of town, the cloud of instability that is gathering over the Horn of Africa. So there is really, Ethiopians have lost meaning in being Ethiopian when their own government has used its entire security and military apparatus against its own people. This is not an exaggeration. It was Tigray. And then it was, as I said, in the south. Then it was Oromia, maybe most parts of Oromia. And then Tigray, and then Amhara, and now Somali region that had remained for the last 7 years. Maybe they were tired of conflict that had remained. What would this do? What would this do this in the area known as the arc of instability? This is what is happening in Ethiopia, which used to be an anchor state. An anchor state as a source of stability in the Horn of Africa. But it cannot even control itself within Ethiopia, within Ethiopia itself. And what was happening around that area? What is the last 7 years? Ethiopia used to be the anchor state, had agreements with everyone that concentrated on isolating Eritrea. Ethiopia was working closely with Kenya, with Rwanda, with the Sudan, with Djibouti, and other regional, even in Somalia, Ethiopia was an important project. It was really an anchor of stability. In Sudan, in South Africa, in West Africa, that was what Ethiopia was. Now Ethiopia is a force for instability in that area, in the region, in the Horn of Africa region. The whole area is now convulsed. Who is actually standing with who in the entire region? Now Egypt has a security, economic, and political agreement with Sudan, for whatever it is, South Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Djibouti, Eritrea, and then they're present in Somalia itself. Ethiopia, that was anchor state that had isolated Eritrea during the Ethiopia itself is now isolated, and it's a cauldron of instability in itself. 120, 130 million people within Ethiopia. Nothing is holding Ethiopia together right now except the absence of an alternative.
Professor,
with Sudan, the way it is, North Sudan and Southern Sudan itself also divided. Kenya itself, which was a stable country, is not politically stable itself these days. And you just said about the Afghanistanization of Somalia and the Yugoslavianization of Sudan. What would that mean for the region? Well, there would be refugees all the way to the southern shores of Europe. It would be an unimaginable catastrophic event if authority collapses in the Horn of Africa, beginning in
Egypt. Going to the remarks that you made about the current political state between Eritrea and Ethiopia, do you think Abiy Ahmed might declare war on Eritrea to annex Eritrean territory in order to marginalize political opponents and also divert attention from the instability that is happening in Ethiopia, using the annexation of Eritrean coastline as a unification process of all Ethiopians?
That's basically what he's doing. I have observed Ethiopian leaders, but I've also studied them. I've never seen a person so focused on preserving his own. I've never seen one. I mean, a prime minister is not quite a permanent leader of a country, because with the small vote of no confidence, you could remove a prime minister. This is a prime minister who built a new palace for himself with money that is equal to the entire federal government budget for 1 year.
Yeah.
He really is focused on preserving his own power. The war with Tigray was not about Tigray, basically. He is a centralizer and someone who wants to rule a unitary state, as he said, as an elected monarch. So that he will do anything. Look, the reason that he is talking about a war with Eritrea to recover Assad, it's of course to divert attention from his own internal problems. It is also to destabilize his opponents. Definitely, those are important. But it is also, more importantly, it is also about eliminating a threat that he feels from Isaias. This is not about Isaias Afwerki as a leader of Eritrea, but as someone who could work with his opponents in Amhara and in other areas of Ethiopia, and could really mobilize the opposition against him. So the threat that he feels is not that Ethiopia lost access to the sea. Ethiopia never lost access to the sea. It has access to the sea through Djibouti, through Barara, through Oromo, and any other port in that area. No problem with that. The goal is to preserve his own power, and he is someone who is able to do anything. To use his own words, that he said that he was willing to take the entire budget of 14 billion of the federal government's budget to fight his opponents. This is a man that had said that he is willing to sacrifice 1 million souls, this is his own speech, to preserve his power. This is a man that could use the entire ENDF and its military arsenal and the budget, which had gone up, by the way, under this PP regime by 70% of military budget. He would stop at nothing. So the one thing that I just wanted to add to what you said about diverting attention, the political attention of the Ethiopian population, and destabilizing the opponents, is an existential threat to him, that he will do anything. Now, if you ask me, it doesn't make any sense, but he will do anything because he's not calculating on the basis of what is possible rationally. He's calculating from feeling a threat from Eritrea. It could be his Waterloo, but he will not stop on anything if he feels that there is a threat to his own hand.
Interesting, Professor. Before we break away, I would like to ask two more questions. The first question is in regards to Jawar Mohammed. Some critics argue that Jawar Mohammed represents a dangerous populism, and others see him as you can say a Malcolm X figure for the Oromo. I see him as a statesman, as a unifying force in Ethiopia. Where do you situate Jawar in a spectrum between, I guess, a radical liberationist and a pragmatic statesman? I think Jawar can present himself to both Ethiopia and Oromo people as a unifying force, and also as an individual who can bring hope and prosperity to Ethiopia.
Well, Jawar could be any number of things, but he evolved. Jawar Mohammed, I know him personally. We've worked together for a long time. So he has evolved. He has grown from his days as a putative leader of the Cairo movement from 2016 to 2018. He is right now speaking calmly, based on knowledge, always strategizing, always adjusting to the demands of the time. So he has definitely grown in stature as a political player. He has political skills. He enjoys politics, the game, the political game, and he's a brilliant man who could amass information, collect information, process it, and then convert it to a strategy, a political strategy, and a series of tactics to achieve his strategic goal. The way he speaks right now, I think the Ethiopian government or his opponents would have a very difficult time tagging him as a divisive figure. That's not what he's saying. He's evolved. That's not what the speech that he's making. He always measured. He's always talking about the importance of peace. He emphasizes that nothing could happen unless Ethiopia stops fighting against itself. Even his criticisms of the Ethiopian leader is measured. He's talking about preserving the state. He says that if we don't have the state, the Ethiopian state apparatus, the point that I made earlier about Rwandization is going to ensue. So he speaks responsibly, creatively, with a measured tone, and he has grown to understand Ethiopia. Maybe his time in prison and his time in solitude and the quiet time that he spent 2 years after he was released from prison, he was probably talking to people and reading books and writing his own books. He's a very different man. I think that's the kind of people that Ethiopia needs, who understand what oppression means, that whatever he opposed that other governments did against to the Oromo, he now opposes that a government that is in power in the name of the Oromo shouldn't be doing it to other people. He's a voice of reason, reassuring, intelligent, brilliant. He has outgrown his weaknesses, so he could be potentially a stabilizing figure in Ethiopia, because unlike the rest of the activists who actually are part-timers, they have their own jobs. he can devote all of his time to politics and doing politics.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wrote an article beforehand when I was talking about Oromia, and I specifically highlighted Jawar Mohammed because I followed him when he was making political speeches as a graduate student, then creating the Oromo Media Network, criticizing Menelik Zenawi, criticizing the APRDF, then afterwards criticizing uh, Abiy Ahmed, but also especially criticizing the tactical marriage between Isaias and Abiy Ahmed to wage war against Tigray. Uh, he's an exceptional, astute individual, and but my fear is that Abiy Ahmed will do whatever it takes to eliminate him from the political scene.
Well, he tried. He tried. By the way, I wrote another article too before, and you wrote an article. I read it, and early on I had written about him, and now I should probably update it and write another article about who he is today, not in 2018. But Abiy Ahmed had tried to assassinate him when he was in Ethiopia in 2019. There was an attempted assassination against him at his home. There was another attempted assassination on the day that the Oromo singer Atalo Hundesa was killed. The plan was to assassinate both Jawar Mohammed and Batala Garba in the aftermath of the death. But Jawar understood where things were going, and he told his own bodyguards to disarm and obey the orders of the people that actually came to kill him. Because I'm familiar with it, I can even names of the people in the defense ministry who actually came for that purpose. So he averted that. And he was in prison for 2 years, where anything could have happened. And those of us who knew him feared that they might even be killed in prison. But I know why he was not killed in prison. It's not because Abiy Ahmed did not want to eliminate him from the political landscape, but people in prison, the wardens and the prison officials, did not make sure that nothing bad happened to him. And since then, yeah, he is trying to be careful, but knowing the Ethiopian political scene and the behavior of the present the prime minister in Ethiopia, who had actually had a hand in the elimination of his own military chief of staff, the Amhara region, the Oromo iconic singer that I just told about, his own friends, who had pushed them out of government and persecuting them wherever they are. His own friends, just like Lama Magarsa, being persecuted wherever he is even today. So, no, I mean, he would do anything. Like I just said, he would do anything. There is no boundary to what Abiy Ahmed is willing and capable of doing to make sure that he remains in power and they enjoy the paraphernalia of power.
Well, last question, Professor, before we depart. Is there a possibility that the Ethiopian military might see another figure very reminiscent of General Andom in deposing Haile Selassie in the same way they would depose Abiy Ahmed? Would the military intervene and depose Abiy Ahmed if his administration has gone too far? If the choice was between Balkanization or Rwandization of Ethiopia and the military taking over the country, the same way they did with Haile Selassie, could that be a possibility to save Ethiopia?
The way the Ethiopian military is now controlled by the prime minister, such as creating parallel institutions. For instance, the chief of staff of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces is not protected by people he himself chose. They is protected by the Republican Guard, which is supposedly an institution, a government institution entrusted with the task of protecting Ethiopian high-level Ethiopian leaders. So the ENDF chief of staff, the chief of staff cannot even assign his own bodyguard. He is actually under the gun of the Republican guard that is created, was created and controlled and financed by the Prime Minister. Given that level of an intricate way of command and control, it's highly unlikely that the military could do anything. I know because I always try to find information. I know that they are dissatisfied. Many of them are dissatisfied, not because they care about larger issues, the welfare of the people, the future of the country, not because of those noble pursuits, but because they have also become rich themselves. He has lavished them with land, properties, money, even some of them paid by his friend Mohammed bin Zayed. So they have a lot of money. So they might want to preserve their institution for their own private interest. But it's very difficult for them to act as a group. I don't see that they could do something, but who knows? There are things that we don't know, because if the level of dissatisfaction is so deep within the body politic, they don't want to go down with him because of several dimensions that this government cannot reassert control. But that's not a question that I want to talk about right now. So they don't want to go down with him. They might end up doing something, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult. But I encourage them to preserve the military institution, to preserve the country, protect the citizens, and make sure that we do not experience the Rwandization model that I just postulated earlier.
No, thank you, Professor. And I want to thank you on behalf of Nzuri Kahawa Report for coming to the podcast and educating 125 million Ethiopians, the African continent, concerning the plight of the Oromos, while also on the current state of Ethiopia and what it means if Ethiopia goes on the balkanization route, what it means for the East Africa region. Hopefully not. Hopefully Ethiopia will find a way out that is democratic, that is peaceful, and it can become a hope, a beacon of inspirations for its neighbors. I guess a form of a stabilizer instead of an agent of instability. So for that, Professor, thank you very much for coming to the Nzuri Kahawa Report. And to our audience, if you do like the Nzuri Kahawa Report, and if you like our guests, we're always going to bring professors, talk about African issues, what's happening in North Africa, East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and we're going to bring the entire continent together in African issues. So if you like it, please subscribe and push the like button. Thank you. Professor.